Good afternoon and hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar with Phil Leonard, who will present his recent research results examining the causal impact of school junk food bans on the body mass index of young Canadians exposed to these bans while in school, and using data from the Canadian Community Health Survey. My name is Sarah Fortin. I'm the Knowledge Transfer Coordinator for the CRDCN. Before I introduce our speaker today, I would like to take just a few minutes to present the network for those of you who may not be familiar with us. Next slide, please. So the CRDCN is a partnership between a consortium of Canadian universities and Statistics Canada, supported by SSHRC, CIHR, and the CFI. As the map shows, it is a truly pan-Canadian network comprising 30 research data centers and branches across the country. Actually, a branch opened just this summer at the University of Northern British Columbia. So research data centers are secure computer labs where a researcher with an approved project can access Statistics Canada confidential microdata from longitudinal surveys, census, and an increasing number of administrative data sets. Actually, as of last week, a new dataset linking the 2006 census to the discharge abstract database is now available in the RDCs. Last year, more than 1,500 researchers from various disciplines have accessed an RDC, and about a third of them were graduate students. The research carried through the network is very diverse and have helped to better understand social and economic developments affecting the whole society, as well as factors affecting individual life course and well-being. This includes population aging, economic integration of immigrants, socio-economic determinants of health, income inequality, labor market participation, and child development. To know more about us, I invite you to visit our website. You see the address right there, and there's a lot for you to know further about us, including the bibliography. So next slide, please. Let me introduce our speaker today. Phil Leonard is a research associate with the Department of Economics at the University of New Brunswick and a health economist, pardon me, for the New Brunswick Institute for Research, Data and Training. His current research interests include health economics, education economics, and program evaluation. He will speak for about 40-45 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A period. Note that during his presentation, all microphones will be automatically muted, except his, of course. Next slide, please. To ask a question, you need to first open the control panel on your on the top right-hand side of your screen, if it's not yet open, and then click the arrow as shown on the slide here. Then you can type your question in the box and press send. I will read it for you after Philip's presentation, and he will answer your questions. Next slide, please. Just want to let you know before we move on that all our webinars are available on our website and on YouTube afterwards, including the PowerPoint presentation. So if you want to have access to these, it will be available most likely tomorrow. So that's it for me. Thank you, Philip, for being with us today and taking the time to share your research results with us. The mic is now over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be able to present my results. So before I start, I'd like to do my own acknowledgements. First to the New Brunswick RDC. So that's where I have done all the research using the Canadian Community Health Survey. So it's great to be able to access the RDC data on campus. And then, of course, would also like to recognize the Maritime SPORE, which is the Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research Support Unit for funding support. So thank you there. So what I'm going to talk about today, as you heard, is junk food bans, as I'm sort of calling them collectively. That's the informal name. Basically, we're talking about policies to regulate within the schools what students can buy. Basically, it's about what the schools can sell. Right, so I'm going to talk about those a bit more, but in terms of the background, I think we're all familiar with, I mean, if you read the newspapers, I think there was even a newspaper article today, in the last 40 years, we see large increases in obesity and overweight across pretty much all developed countries, and that's certainly true in the U.S., as I've got some studies there noting them, and similar trend in Canada. And of course, this is associated with a lot of negative health outcomes, including diabetes and heart disease. And I think one thing that's importantly being clear is that it's not restricted to adults. It's increasingly visible among children, and that's obviously a large concern. Gotta get used to my controls. Okay, so what I have here is just a quick graph of background. So the CCHS, the Canadian Community Health Survey, here's the results for, this is just lumping all the children, and they're of course not all children because some of them, I mean, so the age group goes from 12 to 26, but averaging all of their body mass indexes together, and you see, of course, so what's the trend look like over the past, well, 13 years of data here, and of course, you'll see that there's a few missing years, so the years are the years that the CCHS was actually run. So the first one was actually 2000/2001, and it was initially every other year that the survey was being run, and then from 2007 it gets run annually. So that's why you see those missing years. But still, you can see even in the last, well, that's 13 odd years, you can see for males there's a bit of an upward trend in terms of, this is just the average BMI. It's not the percent who are overweight or obese, but that's the average. And same thing for females. So that's it, the large picture. Now, of course, I've just lumped them all together in that first slide, but of course you're saying, well, 12-year-olds look a lot different from 26-year-olds. So just to give you an idea of what that looks like, BMI increases on average at each age up through 26. And so part of the reason why I chose, I'm focusing mostly on at the average BMI in all of this research, is because when you're thinking about, as any of you have studied BMI will know, that for use, we don't use the standard cutoffs of 25 for overweight and 30 for obesity. There are individualized cutoffs, and it makes it a lot more complicated in the regression analysis. You can use a 0-1 variable indicating is obese or is not obese, but I chose to focus mostly on the question of what's happening at the mean. But not to say that the other question isn't important as well, but this says basically, can these junk food bans have an impact on average body weight? That's the question I'm asking today, rather than can they specifically have an impact on that upper end of the distribution in terms of overweight or obesity. So there you see it. I mean, clearly, typically at 20 years old, we start using the BMI of 20 or BMI of 25 or 30 as the cutoffs for overweight and obesity. But in fact, what we see is that BMI on average continues to trend upwards even right through 26. And if you were to extrapolate past age 26, I think it continues to go up for a while as well. So if we look into more smaller age groupings together, so now here is the average BMI over time for 12 to 15-year-olds. Now we start seeing slightly different trends. So you remember we were seeing sort of steady upward growth when we looked at the whole sample, but in fact for 12 to 15-year-olds, particularly for the women here, you actually are seeing a bit of a declining trend over the time period of the CCHS. And the boys sort of, well, I'm not sure how you describe that. I guess it's either stable or maybe a little bit declining with an uptrend, an uptick at the end. But essentially, and a lot of my results are basically hanging on this sort of table here. Particularly, I'm going to essentially be arguing that some of this, at least some of this decline here for the females, is caused by the changing policies in the schools in terms of restricting the availability of junk food. Because what we don't see, and when you look at the other age groups, the the increasing trend is coming in the other age groups. These so here's 16 to 20 males and females, and you see, I'd say males are sort of steady within the 16 to 20 age group. Females are increasing, and when you look at 21 through 26, basically the same story. So the interesting action is probably what's going on with that youngest age group, and that's where I'm going to see all of my results in terms of the difference estimates. It's all at the lower age group. So we're thinking about, well, why might that be? And I'm going to talk about that. So we've seen this upward trend, and that's, of course, what is concerning to everybody. Why is there this increased trend in obesity and overweight? And there's various explanations for that, and I don't want to take a strong stand on which is the correct. And of course, it's partly, maybe it's partly all of these things, but sedentary work is talked about. Of course, at the child level, that's sedentary lifestyle, so sitting in front of computer games, video games, etc., not exercising to the same extent. There's also, prevalence of high-calorie fatty foods. And a lot of the research seems to be pointing now in terms of the overall calorie intake, in terms of, it's a lot to do with snacking. So a lot of the change over the last 30 or 40 years is that we eat roughly the same number of total calories for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but in between we eat a lot more. But again, I don't want to spend too much time on what's to blame. I want to talk about the next slide, which is how we can, what can we do about it. I just missed the decline in smoking, and actually one study has actually noticed that the decline in smoking actually happens very similar timeline to the increase in obesity, and they thought maybe there could be something there. But moving on, like I said, what I'm actually interested in is what can we do about it, and can we show that any of these strategies to try and address youth overweight and obesity are having any impact. So things that have been either enacted or they've been considered to be enacted, some of the policies that I'm specifically interested are the ones around what goes on in the schools. And so what I'm focusing on today entirely is these school healthy eating policies. What can be sold at the school, and specifically I call them junk food bans, but they're policies that explicitly restrict the sale of foods that are considered to be unhealthy. I'm going to talk about which those are in a second. But of course, there's lots of other policies that may go on at the same time or at different times in different locations. So there are, in Europe right now, I know of several laws. They're talking about doing the same in some of the Quebec cities, where they would have a bylaw specifically restricting how close can a fast food restaurant, or in some cases, how close can a convenience store be located next to an elementary school, for example. So they have, in Europe, there are several jurisdictions with bylaws saying you can't locate a fast food restaurant within, say, 2 kilometers of a schoolyard. And of course, there are other policies around, well, let's try and do the other end of it. If it's not the eating, then it's the expenditure of calories. And so there are policies around physical education and trying to increase the amount of time that students are physically active. And then, of course, more general policies, sugar and or soda taxes. So that's obviously aimed at anybody who's purchasing sugary drinks or sodas. Just general sin taxes, as we know, as a sort of broad policy. There are, of course, labeling policies, so letting people actually know what is in your food, which could make a difference in terms of their choices to what they purchase. And finally, a general policy, restrictions on advertising to children. So that's, to my understanding, in the works right now. There's sort of an ongoing discussion in Parliament in terms of what exactly this is going to look like, but I understand that they're intending to ban advertising of junk food to children. It may follow the model in Quebec, which from 1980 onwards restricted, I think, any advertising directed at children during programming that's aimed at children, or something like that. But what I'm, of course, talking about today is specifically what I'm calling junk food bans. So what do these junk food bans look like? So it's within the school. Well, they first categorize all foods into 3 categories, and so they're maximum, moderate, and minimum nutritional foods. And the minimum nutritional foods are going to be the ones that are going to get banned with certainty. And they're the kinds of things that you typically think of as junk food. So they provide few nutrients. They're generally high in fat, sugar, and or salt. So that's from the New Brunswick policy 711 or 711. And like I said, they're going to include the foods that we typically think of as junk food or very unhealthy food. So chocolate bars, candy, chips, soft drinks, deep fried foods, they're all going to get categorized into that minimum nutrition category. So all of the junk food bans at the provincial level explicitly say you can't sell these within the school. Then the differences across the provinces really focus on how they treat sort of the moderate ones. So some of them, so pizza, for example, might get thrown in the moderate category. And then they might say, well, you can't serve it, or they might say you can serve it once per month, or you can only serve it as a fundraiser, et cetera. So there's a bit of variation in terms of the policies, in terms of what do they do for those moderate level foods, but they all ban the sale of the minimum, the real junk food, what we would think of as junk food. And so the policies that I'm focusing on are provincial level bans. There are a few as well, and I'll talk about that later, how I treat. There's a few during the time of my study where individual school boards set their own policies and go beyond what the province does. But by and large, all of these bans happen at the provincial level, and my next slide is going to show when. And in fact, let's skip to that. So there are these 6 provinces who, at least at the time of my data, had enacted policies. So New Brunswick, well, I'll say New Brunswick was the first, although Nova Scotia started phasing theirs in from 2004. New Brunswick was fully implemented in 2005. Prince Edward Island, the English boards, which represents a very large percentage of the students, had all done by 2005, and then the French board followed in 2006, so there's only a few children left. Quebec, January 2008. Ontario, September 2011. BC elementary schools went a little bit earlier in January of 2008, and the high schools went in September of 2008. So that's all at the provincial level. Now, for the most part, there's nothing else going on. So in the other provinces, Newfoundland, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Northwest Territories, Yukon, and Nunavut, none of them have a provincial level ban. At the time of my data, the only one I knew for sure, Edmonton, had enacted a ban within the Edmonton District School Board. And so I try some runs. I'm going to show you the regression results with it included in, but if you drop Edmonton out, it doesn't change anything. In fact, it makes the results stronger, and that's one of the things. So one thing I'd like to go back and do is try and see, can you measure separately anything going on at the board level in addition to the provincial level. But to the extent that I've missed that now, it's actually biasing my results closer towards a 0 impact. So if I'm mismeasuring and I thought a student wasn't impacted by a ban, but in fact they were because at their local level they got it, I'm actually going to think that they weren't treated, but they were, and so I'm biasing my results closer to 0. So if we find an effect, then in fact the effect should be larger. So that particular part of it, well, it's possible I'm missing the odd small board here or there, is actually biasing towards 0. So as I mentioned before, I'm using the CCHS. I'm using all the years of the data up till when I started the project, so now 2014 is also available, but that's not in my sample. I keep all the youth aged 12 through 26. 12 is the first age at which they start interviewing people in the CCHS. So I had no choice but to start there. I prefer actually to go younger. And 26, I chose that because 25 is actually the oldest you can be to have actually been impacted by any of these bans. So if you were, say, 19 when your last year of high school, or sorry, I guess you'd be 18 in your last year of high school in grade 12, turning 18. So then by the time the earliest ban came in 2005, so by 2013, 8 years later, you could be 26 or 25 or 26. So I think that's why I've got those. So those are the people who can possibly be affected. And that gives a sample of over 150,000 individuals. And of course, as we know, the CCHS is stratified by province and health region. So for this, the descriptives which I provided, it's all using the CCHS sampling weights. The results I'm presenting today don't use the sampling weights, and there's a whole discussion. You can read it, the citation there, Solon, Hayter, and Wooldridge, why you should weight and when you shouldn't. But the results don't make much difference, weighted or unweighted. So what I'm presenting today, the regression results are unweighted results. So some of the things that are great about this study, number one, the intervention is large in the sense that, well, in several senses actually, a large number of students are impacted and they're treated in the literature in terms of this being a program or a policy that they get treated with. So they, a large number of students are impacted because it's whole provinces at a time, right? And that also gives us a huge sample size. The treatment is actually a pretty substantial thing. So it's your full school day, every school day. So it's not all of your life. Of course, it doesn't impact you outside of the school day, but still, most kids spend roughly in the neighborhood of 7 or 8 hours in the school for a given day. So during that time, they can't readily access junk food. So it's a fairly large treatment in that sense. And then students are also treated for as many as 8 years because, as I've said, so the first policies happened in 2005. The last year of my data is 2013. So some of the students in there had actually been in school for the entire 8 years. And speaking of this, so this variation in treatment intensity, so that's what I'm calling how long have you been treated. That's what I'm using as my policy variable. So I'm just counting how many school years were you impacted by one of these school bans on the sale of junk food, and that varies from 0. So anyone who lives in a province that never had a ban is going to have a 0, and then students who are of the wrong age to have been impacted by the ban are going to have a 0 within the provinces that had them, and then depending on how long you've been in school, you're going to increase the number of years that you could be the policy variable, so it varies from 0 to 8 years. And as I said, the data set itself has a large number of observations, both pre and post intervention. The weaknesses of the study, and I hope they're mitigated as best possible, but all of the data, CCHS data, the height and weight are self-assessed. So they phone and ask, how tall are you and how much do you weigh? So there's always measurement error, and particularly on weight, as we know that people are likely to bias downwards. As everyone's likely to report a little bit less than what you actually weigh. Now, so, and then of course the other weakness of the study, so CCHS is not a panel, it's cross-sectional data, so it's repeated cross-sections. So they're not the same students each year, they're a new set of students each year. So we're really talking about a cohort study, so we look at the entire cohort and what's changed over time. Ideally, of course, we'd like longitudinal data where we can track the same students over time. Now, the good news is the methodology of difference and difference should help with both of those issues. In terms of the measurement error, in terms of self-reporting, well, it's self-reporting before and it's self-reporting after. It's self-reporting in the provinces that have a ban, and it's self-reported in the provinces that don't have a ban. So in terms of those comparisons, unless people change the way they misreport their weight before and after the policy comes in, then it shouldn't really be too much of a problem given this methodology. And given, yeah, I mean, so given, anyway, so I'll move on there. So methodological approach, so as I mentioned, so if you're familiar with the sort of economics literature, a difference in difference is the methodology that I'm using here. So for those of you who are more from the health backgrounds, that's similar to a case control methodology, I think. But essentially what you're doing is you're comparing the average BMI before and after in a province that has a ban to the average BMI before and after in the provinces that don't have a ban. And so I've got, here is my my main specification of the regression. So basically we've got on the left-hand side, it's the BMI of a given individual in province P in year Y, and the main variable of importance here is that ban years variable. So what we would expect to see is that, well, if the ban is working to decrease weight of students, then we're going to expect to see a negative coefficient on this B2 or beta 2 on ban years. Right, and then I've controlled for your age, and I've let it be very flexible. It's a cortex, so age squared, age cubed. It doesn't really matter what you do there, as long as it's age and age squared, it lets it be smooth enough. Because as you've seen, the average BMI is going increasing over time, or sorry, with age. Control for gender, although I also run them separately as well, boys and girls. Control for the province. And then I also add a few other controls in some of the specifications, which I'll show you as we go through. But importantly, so in that ban years variable, like I said, so it's linear in my main specification, but then I break it up into kids who have been 1 year or less banned, 1 through 4.5 years, and then 5 through 8 years, because you think that, okay, maybe it's not perfectly linear the way the impacts go. So I'll briefly skim over sort of some of the challenges of difference and difference estimations. So there's a well-known critique of diff and diff papers by Bertrand, Duflo, and Mulanathan. So one of the main concerns is that because you have serial correlation within the clusters, so that's within provinces, you can have, that can bias your standard errors. So you're more likely to find statistically significant results if you don't deal with that. So with enough clusters, so the clusters are the provinces in my case, that's not an issue as long as you use a cluster robust standard error. But there you need to have at least 30 clusters, and I have 13. And so in that case, so all of my results, I'm going to show you the basic cluster robust standard error and then the significance of the result along with a wild bootstrap procedure. So all of these, you'll see the standard error, or sorry, the level of significance with the standard, with the robust standard error, and then once it's done through the wild bootstrap. So just to give you an idea what that variation in the policy variable looks like, so this is for New Brunswick. So as I said, so in New Brunswick, the policy came in 2005. So it's 2006 where you would see the first students who had a full year of policy having been impacted. And so 12-year-olds, 2006 isn't there because the CCHS didn't interview until 2007, right? So 12-year-olds would have had 2 years of the policy variable, or sorry, would have faced the ban for 2 years when in 2007. 19-year-olds, because they graduated at 18, only faced 1 year, and then everyone who's older than that hadn't faced any years of the school ban because they'd already graduated from high school before the ban, right? And so you can see that you get a lot of variation in terms of that policy variable. For 12-year-olds, it goes up 0, 0, 0, and then it's 2, 3, 4, up through 7, years, they can only get to 7 because they've only been in 7 years of school at 12 years old. So that's sort of what it looks like. And then just in terms of how it looks across the provinces, so of course all of the provinces where they never have a ban never have any, they have zeros for that policy variable, and the average years that they've been in here is here, average assuming of the people who are greater than 0. So of course it goes from 0 to 8 in PEI in New Brunswick, who are the first provinces to implement the policy, 0 to 6.5 in Nova Scotia, because they started mid-year, January, 5.5 in Quebec, and 5.5 in BC. So now I'm going to show, this is the most basic regression results. So for the full sample, separating females out and separating the males. And so for the full sample, we see we do have a negative coefficient, so that's 0.046. So that says effectively that each year that you're exposed to a policy ban, so each school year that you can't access junk food, is associated with a decline of 0.04 in your BMI. So that's for the full sample. Most of that seems to be coming from the females, who are statistically significant, whereas the males, overall, it's not statistically significant when you just look at the linear like this. And then it's only once you bootstrapped, though, even for the full sample and for the women, it's only weakly statistically significant. So at 7.8% and 8.8%. So it's only overall weakly significant. But if you break it out, and this is where sort of the headline, so if any of you saw sort of the press release or the abstract, if you break it out, well, let's look specifically at children who have only been banned for 1 year or less. Well, they have this coefficient, which looks almost the exact same size as the linear coefficient for 1 year, so that's as expected. It's insignificant. If you look for kids who have been in 1 to 4.5 years, it's still insignificant. But if you look at kids, where's all the impact coming from? Well, it's kids who have been in there for 5 years or more. It's quite strongly significant, and that's the one. So the average BMI of children who have been banned from junk food for 5 or more years is 0.34 less than kids who haven't been banned. So, well, how much is that? Well, if you're 5'6", that equals about 2 pounds. Okay, so that's kind of the punchline, I guess. That's the main finding. So that's 2 pounds on average. Kids who have been banned from junk food for 5 years or more. So that's sort of the overall result of the paper. So if I summarize that out, like I said, so if you're just looking linearly, each year is weakly significant, each additional year being banned, and it's not significant for boys. But if you focus on those specifically who have been banned for 5 years or more, it's strongly significant for females, not quite as much for males, and like I said, about 2 pounds on average less. Now, I go a little bit further here, so what if we break it out? Because you remember that we looked at those age groupings, and there were a lot of different things happening in at the different age groups. So here we've got it broken out, age 12 through 15, age 16 through 20, and age 21 through 26. And again, so now we've got really strong significance for those 12 to 15-year-olds and insignificant results for everyone else. Okay, so there's a couple reasons why that might be. I'm going to talk about them in a sec. But remember that. So that's 12 to 15-year-olds. And then if you break it out in the same way by have you been exposed for 1 year or less, 1 to 4.5 years, or 5 or more years, now it's significant for if you're looking just at the 12 through 15-year-olds, it's significant for even those who have been only exposed for 1.5 to 4.5 years, and it's strongly significant. So most of the impact is coming from these 12 to 15-year-olds. So when we summarize these results, basically it's almost all of this impact is coming from the youngest individuals. And so there's at least a couple reasons why that might be. So number one, they're still in school at the time of measurement. So up to a 15, obviously at 15, everyone's still in school. And so they haven't gone on, so anyone who's 18 plus has moved on and graduated. And as we know, there's the freshman 15 pounds when you go on to university. And so you may have relapsed, maybe you actually did lose some weight, but then as soon as you got out of high school and went to university, you packed on the pounds again, and so then I can't see it. So that's one potential reason why is it just the youngest kids who are impacted. And then the other one is, of course, so most of those kids are in elementary school. It's a lot less. It's less easy to leave the school campus in elementary school, and in fact, a lot of them specifically, you can't leave the school property without permission or somebody taking you there. Whereas in high school, and certainly once you reach 16, that's when you can start driving. So you're in high school, you're allowed to walk to that McDonald's, which is next door, and when you hit 16, you can drive to that convenience store. So one of the criticisms always of these programs was that, oh, well, they're not going to work, kids will just get junk food from elsewhere. So what seems to be, or what may be the story is, yes, well, the older kids, they can just get junk food from elsewhere, and maybe they do, but at least for the younger kids, we're seeing a strong impact, and for those kids, we do see that they lose some weight when they can't access junk food in the school. So just some of the things I did as robustness checks. So these are the kinds of things that economists want to check on, but you would expect that the policy variable shouldn't have any impact on height. It doesn't, so that's just a check that we do to make sure that it doesn't impact something which it shouldn't, because if it does, then you've got a real problem with your specification. And likewise, the years to ban variable, so that is, you want to look at the kids who are out to be affected. You don't want to see an impact of the policy before the policy actually was implemented. And so, fortunately, that's also the case. So there's no impact of the policy variable prior to the policy being in place. So that's a sort of reassuring thing that we're picking up something real here, that it's not just something going on in the data otherwise. And it doesn't really matter whether you include, because of course the CCHS is stratified by health region as well, and so it doesn't matter if you include dummy variables for them. It doesn't matter if you control for some of the other factors, so visible minority, which might be things that might be related to weight. The results hold up more or less the same regardless of what you include there. So in terms of concluding, so in terms of this study, basically I'm arguing that it's supportive that junk food bans are having some sort of positive effect, by which I mean a negative effect, dropping your weight, on student BMI. The impact seems to be stronger and it's more robust on females, and it's definitely much stronger on the younger students, that is to say, so they're the only ones who we can see a consistent impact. So as I said, so I presented the average result for all the provincial programs in Canada. So there are some slight variations within those provinces. What I am showing is an average impact of all of them together. So it's possible, for example, that some of the provinces have more strict policies and may actually have better impacts than another policy which is a little bit weaker. But this is an average effect. And like I said, again, the punchline is, well, if you've got a child who's been in for 5 years or more, they're on average roughly 2 pounds lighter than a kid who's never been exposed to a junk food ban. So just in terms of, well, where do we go from here? As I said, some of the weaknesses of the study, hope to continue to improve on those. So one of the things I'd like to do is use the NLSCY. So there you've got longitudinal data, do a very similar thing. Now, of course, you have smaller samples and you have issues with attrition. So, so there's pros and cons with any data set. I'd also like to look and see, do these types of programs have any impact on your actual educational outcomes. So when, at least in New Brunswick, when they implemented this program, they said, look, this program is going to make our kids, they didn't just talk about weight, they said they're going to give them the best chance to succeed in school, and they're going to have better educational outcomes because the students are going to be more alert, they're going to be less distractible, they're going to have eaten healthily, etc. And so they're going to sit there and be good students. So I'm not at this point convinced that I'll necessarily see anything, but I'm going to check it out. My plan is to check and see whether can you see any impact on test scores before and after these bans. And then longer term, I'm thinking about working on sort of a larger sort of extension of terms of what's going on in the school area. So you want to look at the impact of fast food proximity. So is there any justification, for example, for trying to ban fast food restaurant being too close to a school? So that's sort of some of the stuff I'm thinking of doing next. So for those of you who are out there, if you do want to see the results of that first study, the link is there. So it's now published and it's open access for download, so feel free to have a look. Other than that, so I think I'm done and I'm open to questions.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was very interesting. I invite participants to now take a minute to write your question, and I have one already by my colleague Grant Gibson. So can you identify a difference in children who have never had junk food in schools versus children who have had junk food in school at least 1 year? And he concludes saying, I would think that the margin of bringing your own is different between these two groups.
I'm sorry, what was the last bit? The margin of bringing your...
Bringing your own is different between these two groups.
Bringing your own food?
Your own food, I suppose, your own lunch, possibly?
Yeah, so the answer to the first part of the question is if you're talking about just... I'm not 100% sure I'm understanding, but so this would be so this one here is the result, or if you go overall for this 1 year, so this is basically kids who have been only impacted for 1 single year. So I think so if I'm understanding the question correctly, then the answer is no, I can't. I mean, so it's statistically insignificant. So in their first year, I can't see a clear difference. But I'm not quite sure how that links to the part about are they more or less likely to bring. I mean, certainly part of the whole issue is, so to what extent are they bringing their own food? And of course I can't observe that, so I don't know. I only see sort of their weight outcomes before and after a ban. But you're certainly right. So it's possible, say, so with these diff and diff studies, I don't know the mechanism. So is it the case that it could be the case that this ban, so now I can't buy a burger and fries at school, so I start packing my lunch all the time? Or it could be the case that I can't buy a burger and fries at school, so now I buy their salad, and I have no idea which of those it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Maybe just to go on this question, I was wondering myself, I'm not an expert about child health, but I was kind of disappointed to that the average decline that you found is 2 pounds. Mm-hmm. To me, that seems like very little, but maybe, of course, this is the average. And again, building on Grant's question, maybe could you compare children who had normal, let's say, body weight mass at the start of the treatment compared to children who had overweight, and see if the impact on those children who did need actually to eat more healthy was greater?
Yeah, absolutely. One could and one should. So like I said, so all the results so far are at the mean, but one absolutely could and probably should look, because most people are interested in terms of the likelihood of obesity or overweight. So certainly you can, instead, right now I've got linear regression, but you can do a probit or a logit and say the probability of being overweight, or so effectively what you're doing is just looking at different points in the distribution and saying, are you more likely to be impacted here? And so, or you could, yeah. So I think that, yeah, I think that's it. That you yes, absolutely can look at different points in the distribution, and you may well. Now, in terms of the overall, I guess I don't see 2 pounds as being small. Yes, it's not by itself. That's not going to be enough to turn the tide of obesity, certainly. But you know, for a policy that is fairly, like, it costs the government not very much. There's possibly some costs in terms of, you know, initially some of the cafeterias were saying we don't make as much money now, so, you know, there's some cost, but by and large, it's not a very expensive program, right? Like, they just say we're not going to sell you junk food anymore. So, in terms of cost effectiveness or something like that, I'd say if you could drop 2 pounds off the average student for doing very little, just changing what is on the menu at school.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So I have another question from Isabelle Scantland-Lebel. She says, some schools offer foods that are similar in terms of fat, sugar, and calories to fast food chains. Was the cafeteria menu evaluated and accounted for in your study?
Yeah, so the short answer is no. So I don't have specifics of each school. I have sort of specifics at the provincial level. So I think what you're talking about is the extent to which they actually follow the rules. And so,
right.
And that I don't necessarily know. I've heard, certainly in New Brunswick, I've heard instances where people say, oh, well, you know, our school, you know, since the ban, they're still selling French fries once a week or stuff like that, you know, where they're effectively breaking the rules. And so I can't really observe that using these data, but I guess, I mean, so if that's the case and we're still seeing the impacts, I would actually argue, well, if we can get compliance up even higher, then we should see a larger impact. Yeah. But you're quite right in terms of, I know, well, I've heard of instances where people are saying the compliance is far from perfect.
Thank you. And here's another one from Charla Goodwin. They are not really unhealthy food bans, and they are not enforced in any province. Sorry, I wonder if I'm at the beginning of the question here. Let me see. Yeah. Let me see. It seems to be quite long question. I just want to make sure that, okay. So they are not really unhealthy food bans, and they are not enforced in any province. In PEI, we know that adherence has slipped a lot since the original policy implementation due to lack of enforcement and support at the management level. The school nutrition policies across Canada are also varied and patchwork, and I don't always apply to all foods available in school. They also don't apply to foods brought from home, of course. Is it possible there's another program or policy that these results are being influenced by, considering the various policy may not actually be influencing food available in school as much as it is assumed?
Okay, so I guess there's multiple parts to that. So I think we already touched a little bit on the compliance, and the point is very valid. There are compliance issues. But if you think about, I guess I would argue this, I mean, certainly there are compliance issues. It's far from perfect. But is the average food served in a school where there's a, you know, one of these policies compared to, you know, when I grew up in high school, I ate a burger and fries and Coke literally every single day for lunch. You just can't do that now. And so I think there has been a change within the schools. Now, you can argue, and I think you're right, that compliance is still far from perfect. We've got a long way to go. But even if compliance is, you know, half what you would like it, maybe that's why we only have 2 pounds and not 4 pounds, for example. Yeah. So that's part of it. And then, is it possible that other things are going on? Absolutely. I've done my best to control for them where I know about them. And so, for example, BC is the one where I know for sure when they actually implemented their junk food policy, they also implemented at the same time a more physical activity policy.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the, all I've been able to do for that is just drop BC out of the sample, and you still get the same results. So in that sense, and that likewise, that's why we do these sort of, when I talked about the where are we here, the robustness checks. One of the things you want to do, that's why this years to ban policy variable. So I've checked, okay, well the students, can I see that those students just before the ban, was there already a pre-existing trend, right? That's what you're really checking there, that maybe something else is explaining it. And so we're checking for these pre-existing trends. Is something going on first that really was it? So to the extent possible, it seems like it's actually the bands that are doing something, and certainly maybe they should be doing even more if the adherence were better.
Can you tell just, I don't know if you can summarize it, because of course there are several provinces who adopted such bans, but normally is it like a 1 kilometer ban on junk food, or 2 kilometers? Sorry. What is it, the typical policy?
Sorry, what I'm talking about here, mine are what the school itself sells.
Oh, I see, understand. Sorry, I thought it was about, okay. So it's really...
there are also policies, what you just mentioned, like bans on fast food, but that's only, as far as I know, only Europe has those right now. I haven't heard of any in Canada.
So it's really in the cafeteria.
Yeah, and we're talking about what the school sells, or it could be, and they're extended to what are sold in terms of fundraisers and stuff. So can you sell pizza at lunch?
Yes.
For a fundraiser, etc.
I understand. Sorry about that. Okay. So Julie Atkinson is asking, a lot of New Brunswick schools aren't following the policy. Again, I wonder how great the impact would be if they did. Will these results be shared with the school principals? It may help get their support.
Well, so on the compliance issue, again, I agree. I've shared the results, so I presented it already to government in terms of, I presented it to Department of Health. I've sent it to the Department of Education. It was in, when it first came out, the newspapers were really interested in it. Anything to do with child health is popular in the newspapers. So if they don't know about it, I guess, I feel like I've done as best I can so that they do.
As knowledge transfer coordinator, maybe we could talk after this webinar and prepare a brief research highlight that we could circulate across New Brunswick to the school principals.
That'll be fine, sure.
Yeah, let's talk about it. All right, another question. Again from Grant, my colleague Grant Gibson. How concerned are you that the provinces where child obesity was most prevalent were the first to put in the bans, and is thinking about policy endogeneity?
Yep. Yeah, it's certainly a possibility, and it's something, again, so the best I have to fall back on is sort of these, the robustness checks, like I said, so we don't see any pre-existing trend there, but you're right. With only, and that's, so the two things I have to defend against that is that, well, we've done these robustness checks and they check out, so hopefully it appears that it's not something specific to those areas because we don't see anything happening until the ban happened. And then of course the clustering of the standard errors with the wild bootstrapping is supposed to give you cluster robust standard errors. So that's a bit, but certainly it's still some possibility. I mean, certainly it's not likely that the implementation was perfectly random. So I accept that.
All right, I don't have, I'll leave maybe a minute because I was again surprised by another, it's not so much your results than the fact that, you know, the statistics at the beginning that you present between boys and girls. And it seems that the boys had higher. I don't know if it's
Yeah.
significant or not, and is that higher in the sense of being overweight? Can you tell me us a little bit more about it, if you can, between the boys and the girls?
You mean in terms of my results, in terms of the impact, or just on average? Like, so if you're looking at the slides,
Both,
like
actually, but whatever. Both in terms of, in general, you know, the baseline, and then in terms of the impact.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the difference just in general is, well, I mean, I don't want to get into too much of cause, but so certainly
Girls tend to underreport their weight.
Okay, that could be one. There's multiple possibilities. I would say, assuming we have it right, but I think even if you measure, even measured weight, females have lower BMI. So I think it's more, I mean, part of it's muscle mass, one part of it. Part of it's actually eating. I think females pay more attention to such things, whether rightly or wrongly. I think there's more pressure placed on girls to be thin, whereas I think boys don't face the same pressure. So part of it's just physiological differences, and some of it's societal differences. But certainly I think it's common that BMI is higher for males than females. And then in terms of the results, so and I don't want to. I only know this one other study, but the point I'm going to make is that so it seems like this one, which is impacting what you can eat, is impacting the females a little bit stronger. I've seen other results where, from the States, where it seems like programs which force people to do more exercise seem to have impacted the males more. So I don't want to necessarily, I don't know that I can necessarily explain that, but that's what the results seem to be showing.
All right, thank you. So no one else came forward with a question. So it's almost 2 o'clock in a way. So I guess I will thank you, Philip, for taking the time to share your result with us today. Very interesting, informative. And I'd like to remind participants that yes, the video and the PowerPoint will be available shortly on our website. And also mention the fact that if you are in Montreal in November, we'd love to welcome you for our annual conference, which is taking place here this year on November 14 and 15. So join us if you can. So thank you again, Philip, and have a nice day all.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.